She did not say goodbye to anyone. She left her uniform folded on the bed, her name badge sitting on top of it, and walked out of Balmoral Castle at 2:30 in the morning. She did not collect her final paycheck. She did not leave a note. She just disappeared into the Scottish darkness and never looked back. Her name has never been published. But she was not the first. And she was not the last. Something is happening inside the walls of one of the most famous castles on Earth. Staff are vanishing. Not fired. Not reassigned. Vanishing. Walking away from a job that most people in Britain would consider an honor, a privilege, even a dream. And the rate at which they are leaving has started to raise very uncomfortable questions about what exactly is going on behind those ancient granite walls. To understand why people keep disappearing from Balmoral, you first have to understand what Balmoral is supposed to be. It sits in the Cairngorms, deep in the Scottish Highlands, surrounded by mountains so old they look like they have been there since before history started. The nearest town is a 20-minute drive. In winter, the valley fills with a silence so complete you can hear your own heartbeat. The castle itself is built from pale grey granite that turns silver when it rains, which in this part of Scotland is most of the time. It has 167 rooms, turrets, a ballroom, manicured gardens, a river running through the grounds. It is, by almost any measure, one of the most beautiful private estates in the world. The royal family bought it in 1852. Prince Albert fell in love with the land and had the original house torn down so he could build something grander. He designed parts of it himself, including the narrow hallways he engineered deliberately so that family members would constantly brush past each other. He believed closeness in architecture created closeness in family. He was not thinking about the maids who would spend the next century and a half cleaning those narrow corridors every single morning. For generations, working at Balmoral carried a certain status. You told people where you worked and their eyes went wide. You were inside the circle. You were trusted. You were part of something ancient and important. The staff manual described service at the castle as a calling, something higher than ordinary employment. And for a long time, people believed that. They came from villages across Scotland and England, young women mostly, arriving with pressed uniforms and careful handwriting on their application letters, ready to give themselves to the institution. But something began to change. Quietly at first. A maid here. A groundskeeper there. Gone. Then faster. Then in groups. By the time anyone on the outside noticed, the problem had been building for decades. And what was driving it was not one single thing. It was a system. A way of operating that had been locked in place for so long that the people running it had stopped being able to see it clearly. They had confused tradition with fairness. They had mistaken silence for contentment. And they had built an entire workforce culture on a single idea that was written, without any apparent irony, into the official staff manual. Loyalty is its own reward. 4 words. That was the official explanation for why the maids at Balmoral were not paid more. That was the institution's answer to the question of compensation. You should feel honored. That should be enough. But let's talk about what a day at Balmoral actually looked like for the women that phrase was aimed at. The alarm went off at 6 in the morning. Not 6:30. 6. While the rest of Scotland was still dark and sleeping, the junior maids were already on their feet, moving through stone corridors so cold in winter that their breath hung in the air in small white clouds. Their first task was the silver. Over 200 individual pieces, polished by hand, one by one, until every surface held a reflection. This had to be finished before breakfast service at 8. No exceptions, no delays. After silver came the tea service. Heavy kettles carried through long hallways. The rule was silence. The royal dogs were light sleepers and no one wanted to be the maid who woke them. Lunch brought 18 kilograms of potatoes to peel. Then a uniform change before the 4 o'clock afternoon tea service. After tea, the muddy hunting boots came in from the grounds. Every pair, cleaned. After dinner, more service. More silence. More invisible movement through rooms they were not supposed to exist in. Most nights, the maids reached their beds just before 10. 15 hours after they had left them. For this, in 1983, a junior housemaid at Balmoral earned $18,000 a year before tax. She lived on the estate, which sounds like a benefit until you understand what that actually meant. She lived in the attic. A room barely large enough for a single bed and a small wardrobe, shared with 2 other women. The windows were thin glass against Scottish winter winds. In January, the cold came through those walls like something alive. Management had banned heaters in the attic rooms. Fire risk, they said. in rooms where 3 young women were sleeping. In 1987, the staff were promised warmer quarters by 1990. By 1998, researchers interviewing former employees were still hearing stories about rain leaking through broken slate above their beds, about waking up in uniforms still damp from the cold, about breathing frost onto the walls at night. 2 maids contracted pneumonia. Both were fired for missing work. They got sick because of where they were made to sleep. And then they were removed for getting sick. Here is the part that stays with you. There was a rule at Balmoral that every new maid was told about during their first week. If a royal had just left a room, and you entered moments later to clean it, you were required to curtsy. Even if the room was completely empty. Even if there was nobody there. You were honoring the presence that had just occupied the space, the spirit of royalty, still lingering in the air. During one formal evening in 1987, staff records show this empty room curtsy was performed 61 times in a single night. By the end of the evening, supervisors were quietly handing out bandages alongside the serving trays. The maids had bruised their knees so badly on the stone floors that several needed help walking back to the attic. One woman, when asked about it years later, said it felt like bowing to something that was not there. Giving reverence to an absence. That image tells you something important about the psychology of Balmoral. About the gap between the performance of loyalty and the lived experience of the people performing it. Because here is the thing. These women were not strangers to hard work. They had not arrived expecting luxury. They had come knowing the hours were long and the demands were high. What they had not expected was the silence. There was a strict code at the castle. You did not speak unless spoken to by a royal. You did not react to what you overheard. You did not acknowledge anything you witnessed in the private spaces of the estate. You were expected to move through the rooms of other people's lives like furniture that had learned to walk. The penalty for breaking this code twice was dismissal and the loss of your seasonal bonus, a sum that for women earning barely enough to survive represented weeks of income they could not afford to lose. So the maids developed their own language. A system of hand signals passed quietly between them during service. A tap on the wrist. A tilt of the head. Small gestures built from necessity, because speaking was too dangerous. An entire internal world running silently beneath the world the royals were allowed to see. One former maid said the corridors of Balmoral were the quietest place she had ever been in her life. Not because people were at peace. Because everyone was afraid. Fast forward to 2024. A leak of internal royal payroll documents made headlines across Britain. The numbers were precise and they were brutal. A senior royal aide was earning $146,000 a year. A maid was earning $19,500. She was sharing a bedroom. The gap between those two figures was more than 7 to 1. That same year, the public funding given to the royal family had increased by 41% over the previous decade. Maid wages over the same period had risen by 6%. Experts calculated that closing the gap entirely, raising every maid at Balmoral to a fair wage, would cost $187,000 annually. That is less than the estate spent resurfacing its private helipad. One resurfacing job. That was the distance between exploitation and fairness. And still, the manual said loyalty is its own reward. Then came the gardens. Between 2023 and 2025, King Charles embarked on a project to make the Balmoral estate completely carbon neutral. Organic. Self-sustaining. Food grown by hand from the estate's own soil. In principle, it sounded like a vision. In practice, it meant tractors were banned. Hoses were replaced with rainwater barrels. 12 workers were expected to maintain thousands of acres of garden by hand, making up to 90 wheelbarrow loads of compost and material every single day. One man lifted over 200 kilos of compost daily until his body gave out. He tore his shoulder hauling a load alone. He did not receive proper sick pay. He was placed on government benefits of $116 a week. 9 days after that injury, 11 of the 12 gardeners quit together. They walked out as a group. Only one stayed. The palace brought in an emergency response team. But the quiet departure of 11 people who had given their bodies to a royal vision told a story that no official statement could undo. The moment that broke the silence publicly came not from a journalist or a government investigation. It came from a young woman on an internet forum. In June 2023, a maid posted screenshots. Her mother was going into surgery. She had applied for emergency leave. She had taken only 2 of her 10 available leave days that entire year. The request was denied. She was told she was needed to press and starch bed linens for a royal visit. She quit the same day she got that answer. And she posted the entire exchange online. Within 48 hours, over 11,000 people had commented. The story moved from forums to national newspapers. It became the center of a conversation about what the people who maintain royal life are actually owed in return for maintaining it. 2 weeks later, a job listing appeared on a recruitment website. Room attendant, Balmoral Castle. $10.50 per hour. Start immediately. 5 more maids had already resigned by then. The palace brought in temporary workers from nearby areas to cover the gaps. Those temporary workers were paid $19 an hour, nearly double the rate of the trained, loyal staff they had come to replace. The people who had curtsied to empty rooms for years earned half the wage of strangers hired in a crisis. That is not an accident of accounting. That is a system revealing its values. Balmoral Castle is genuinely extraordinary. The history inside those walls is real. The landscape surrounding it is one of the most beautiful places in Britain. None of that is in question. What is in question is the invisible architecture of that place. The rules nobody discusses. The wages that never quite reached fair. The attic rooms that stayed frozen long after promises were made to fix them. The maid who walked out at 2:30 in the morning and left her badge on the bed. She was not the first. And the rate at which people are leaving suggests she will not be the last. The castle has stood for over 150 years. The mountains around it will be there for 150 more. But the question that lingers, the one that does not have an easy answer, is whether an institution that built its staff culture on the idea that loyalty is its own reward will ever understand that loyalty, real loyalty, the kind that keeps people walking through your gates in the Scottish dark at 6 in the morning, has to be earned in return. What do you think? Has the royal family ever truly valued the people who keep that castle running? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if this story opened your eyes to something you had never considered before, make sure you subscribe. Every week we go behind the walls that official history would rather keep closed.